Hello students, this is Mr. Balsiger with an environmental science video. Welcome. We've been talking a lot about Earth as an egg, and we decided that if you cut the egg in half and we looked at it from the cross section, we can make analogies about this egg to Earth, and we've been talking specifically about the egg shell, which is a lot like Earth's crust. And the reason why we're using an egg is that it's about roughly to scale a good representation of the Earth. We also talked about how the Earth has eggshell or crust broken into pieces. Some of these pieces are oceanic crust and other pieces are continental crust. And so we began thinking about how these pieces of eggshell could move at one another or maybe away from one another, and they cause different types of plate boundaries. So this video is made to talk to you about the different type of plate boundaries that occur on planet Earth. Specifically, we're going to practice talking about divergent boundaries. And if you think about diverge, this means to move apart. And we're also going to be talking about convergent boundaries, which means to come together. So let's practice our drawings. If you could get your piece of paper out, this would actually substitute, if you wanted, for Roman numeral 4a, which is called Plate Interactions Lecture. And so if you wanted, you could substitute your assignment Plate Interactions lecture for the discussion of plate boundaries. First off, let's identify the two types of plates, two types of Earth crust. The first type of crust is a thick type of crust called continental crust. And this is where we live. This is us. If it weren't for continental crust, we'd all be underneath the ocean. Continental crust is about 30 kilometers thick on average, and it's made up of the rock granite. And the way that we remember that it's made up of granite is don't take it for granite. Otherwise, you'd be under the water, because the other type of crust is only about 1/6 as thick on average. This is 5 kilometers thick on average, and this is called oceanic crust. The oceans sit on top of it. It's 5 kilometers thick on average, and it's made up of basalt. And a way to remember that, the way I remember is, well, oceans are salty. Basalt is the type of rock. We've held these rock samples in class. Basalt is this black, a little bit more dense rock. Granite is a less dense rock. And the density differences is often used in textbooks to describe prediction of which one subducts. We made a mental image of sitting in a hot tub and with no jets, and you have a big piece of styrofoam floating. Imagine like a 8-inch thick piece of styrofoam block floating in a hot tub, and this would represent a thin, maybe a 1-inch thick piece of plywood. And when we start doing mental experiments about maybe pushing these together, we can imagine that if we were sitting in a hot tub, the plywood would go underneath the styrofoam. And this helps us imagine why the oceanic crust is the one that subducts underneath the continental crust. So let's get to our drawings. The first thing we can think about is if we have if we have a converging boundary, there can be a menu of 3 possible types of crust converging. We can have continental crust coming into oceanic crust. We could have oceanic crust coming into oceanic crust converging, or we can have continental crust converging toward continental crust. And really, these are the 3 types of converging boundaries, and different things happen to them because continental crust is 30 kilometers thick on average, where oceanic crust is only 5 kilometers thick on average. So different things happen when they attack each other. Let's try to draw them and wrap our heads around what happens. So let's imagine we have a bird's eye view and we see this continent. Let's call it continent X. And we have this oceanic piece of Earth's crust, and we'll call it oceanic crust Y. If these two things are coming together, these two plates, then we can begin to predict what type of plate tectonics we'll see. We've already discussed how continental crust is 6 times thick on average, and oceanic crust is just 5 kilometers thick on average. So let's try to draw a cross section of it. First, let's set up the continental crust being nice and thick. Oceanic crust is coming toward it. Both of these pieces of crust are floating on the mantle. So this is the oceanic crust, this is the continental, and they're coming toward each other at a converging boundary. If you go back to our mental experiment of the hot tub, if you push plywood at styrofoam, the plywood would go underneath. And so we end up seeing this subduction occur. The plywood goes underneath the continent and we get a subducting zone. We see a trench. And that's kind of neat. The deepest parts on planet Earth aren't in the middle of the ocean, but they're at these subduction zones where one plate moves underneath the other. As this plate dives underneath, we get shallow earthquakes to medium to deep. And our seismologists in class will remember that data. It looked like rainbows, red to orange to green to blue earthquakes, showing shallow to medium to deep earthquakes. And then here, once the plate subducts enough, it dives down into the mantle, and we get this heating and friction that causes melting. And if you think about a lava lamp, as it melts, it heats up, it becomes less dense and rises. And so what happens is this magma rises, begins pushing through the crust, and we end up getting a volcanic mountain range on the crust. So we have earthquakes, shallow to medium to deep as the crust subducts underneath, and then volcanic mountain range occurring as well. So this is a converging boundary when we have a continent coming into an ocean. If you were to Google image search Juan de Fuca and American plate, you would find all these great images. Where we actually are in Bellingham, right here, we have the Cascade Mountain Range, and this is actually what's happening. We have the plate of Juan de Fuca slipping underneath the North American plate as fast as your fingernail grows-ish, and causing Mount Baker and Mount St. Helens and Mount Rainier. They're in the Cascade Mountain Range. Let's do the next type of converging boundary. Let's do converging boundary, oceanic to oceanic. Now here in your imaginary environment, we have a piece of oceanic crust coming at a piece of oceanic crust, and they're moving toward one another. When this occurs, one plate will subduct underneath the other. When this occurs, we get the shallow to medium to deep earthquakes. We get trenches. We get the trench again here at this boundary. And we also get, again, this heating down here as it subducts and melts, and it begins rising and going toward the surface, and we end up getting volcanic mountain ranges here. Sometimes these can actually build up high enough to stick out of the water, and we can actually form islands. So when you get a converging oceanic to oceanic boundary, one of the oceanic plates subducts, causes a volcanic mountain range, and we get a nice little cross section that looks like this. The third type of converging boundary is when we have continents running into continents. So converging continent to continent. Here, if you're doing your mental imagery with us of sitting in a hot tub, you're pushing a big block of styrofoam at another big block of styrofoam. The continental crust is 30 kilometers thick on average, and it's less dense. It's made of granite typically, and you end up getting these piles. Almost imagine a towel being pushed at itself and it piles up. Here, because there is no subduction, that means that there are no volcanoes being formed. So we don't have any rising magma. If you remember, the key to volcanoes is we need a source of rising magma that causes the volcanoes to form. So in our converging continental to continental boundary, we show thick crust coming at each other, no volcanoes being formed. Our final type of plate boundary is going to be the divergent boundary. Divergent boundaries create oceanic crust. If you remember our map of the new plate boundaries, if we looked in between, if this was Africa and this was the edge of North America, in the middle of the ocean was the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. And along here, the geochronologists in the class saw red crust on the boundary, and it got older as it moved away. This shows that new crust is being formed as the crust moves away from the boundary edges. And this is a divergent boundary. Oceanic crust is formed. So if I ask you what type of crust is at an oceanic boundary, at a diverging boundary, you could discuss the oceanic crust. So if we want to draw the diverging plate boundary, diverge means to split apart, we're going to be drawing oceanic crust splitting away from oceanic crust. So we're going to draw our thin crust because it's oceanic. Oceanic crust is 5 kilometers thick on average. And it's moving away from each other. The geographers in the class will tell you that there's a underwater mountain range at the mid-Atlantic boundary. And so imagine that as the crust is being formed and pushed out of the earth, it kind of gets pushed up for some reason. We get this underwater mountain range at the boundaries. So because we have rising magma that's causing this to come out, we also see some volcanoes occur. So you could imagine some volcanoes along this boundary. And this is also where we see the thin, shallow line of earthquakes. Maybe that's because the crust is only forming as it's coming out to the surface of Earth, and so we just see a thin, shallow line of earthquakes here as the oceanic crust moves apart, showing that there's an underwater mountain range here. By kind of piling it up on itself would be a good way to show a diverging plate boundary. So, in summary, are 3 types of converging boundaries. We had a converging boundary of continental to continental, where we showed thick crust moving at each other and piling up in the middle. This is like the Himalayan mountain range, no volcanoes. Earthquakes are mainly shallow, but there are a few medium earthquakes as well. Another type of boundary was if we had continental coming together to oceanic. So we show a thin piece for oceanic, a thick piece for continental. Oceanic subducts underneath, rises, causes volcanoes, shallow to medium to deep earthquakes. We also had oceanic to oceanic boundary converging, and they would come at one another. One subducts underneath, subduction causes volcanoes, and we see the shallow to medium to deep earthquakes. So that's it. You should have 4 drawings. You should be able to show me the 3 types of converging boundaries. You should be able to show me the diverging boundaries, and hopefully that helps. Volcanoes form when we get rising magma. Subduction gives us rising magma. Thanks for tuning in.